On the night of April 15th, 1912, the RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Since that fateful morning, one question has lingered in the minds of many. Could anyone have survived, trapped inside the Titanic after she went down? Imagine this. You're in a room. It's quiet, eerily quiet. Then, a sudden jolt. The floor tilts. You stumble. Something's wrong. Alarms sound and a cold wind rushes in. You run to the door, but it won't open. Outside, panic. Water's coming, fast, but you're still alive. And now, the ship is sinking. Not everyone knows this, but the RMS Titanic didn't just vanish in an instant. It took over 2 hours for the unsinkable giant to slip beneath the waves. That's more than enough time for chaos, confusion, and terrifying possibilities. So here's the question. When the Titanic finally disappeared beneath the surface that night, was anyone still alive inside? Could someone have survived, trapped in an air pocket, clinging to life, deep under the sea? It's one of the most haunting and human questions history has to offer. A ship of dreams and tragedy. To understand this chilling possibility, we need to revisit that fateful night, April 14th, 1912. The Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, was steaming through the icy North Atlantic at about 22 knots. On board were over 2,200 souls, rich and poor, young and old, hopeful immigrants and millionaires. At 11:40 p.m., disaster struck. An iceberg, lurking in the dark, scraped along the starboard side of the ship. Steel buckled, rivets popped, seawater gushed into the forward compartments. The unsinkable ship was doomed, but not immediately. From the moment of impact, Titanic stayed afloat for over 2.5 hours. In that window of time, lifeboats were lowered, distress flares fired, and passengers scrambled for answers and exits. Some made it. Many did not. Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating palace with grand staircases, ornate dining rooms, and beneath it all, a dark and confusing labyrinth of narrow corridors and cabins, especially in third class. When the iceberg hit, panic spread unevenly. Many passengers, particularly those in the lower decks, didn't even realize the seriousness of the situation until it was too late. Water rushed in, doors jammed. Gates meant to enforce class divisions became deadly barriers. Now imagine someone in that situation. They couldn't reach the upper decks. But maybe they made it to a storage room, a locked pantry, a sealed cabin. The water rose, and then stopped. For a moment, they're trapped, alone. The ship begins its final plunge. Everything above is chaos. But below, silence, cold, darkness, and maybe air. As Titanic's front dipped into the ocean, the stern rose higher and higher, exposing the massive propellers. Eventually, the ship broke in two. The bow plummeted first, followed by the stern minutes later. Inside, hundreds were still trapped. Some would have drowned instantly. Others may have been crushed. But a small number, maybe just one or two, could have found themselves inside a pocket of air, a sealed space that kept the water at bay, temporarily. Is this even possible? Shockingly, yes. In 2013, Harrison Okin, a cook on a sunken tugboat off the Nigerian coast, survived 2.5 days underwater in an air pocket. He was trapped in complete darkness, 100 feet deep, surviving on small amounts of oxygen until rescuers miraculously found him. And that wasn't the first time something like that happened. During World War II, submarine crew members and even people on torpedoed ships survived for hours in sunken compartments. It's rare, it's terrifying, but it's real. So back to Titanic. Could the same have happened there? In theory, yes. Titanic had rooms and spaces that may have remained intact during its descent. And as the ship sank vertically, the pressure inside some compartments could have sealed them for a few moments longer, allowing air to remain trapped. Because it reminds us that Titanic wasn't just a story of engineering and icebergs. It was a story of real people, real fear, real pain. And maybe, just maybe, one person who held on to life longer than anyone ever imagined. It was a face the world had never seen. When deep-sea explorers first illuminated the ghostly remains of the Titanic in 1985, they weren't expecting it. Amid the crumpled steel and decaying elegance, nestled quietly in the corner of a shattered cabin was a skeleton, arms curled as if in prayer, still holding a metal crucifix. No name, no records, no surviving relatives, just the bones of a man who seemed to have met death in peace or in desperation. So who was he? And why has no one been able to identify him over a century later? Let's uncover the truth behind the mystery man with the crucifix, one of Titanic's most chilling and human secrets. When Robert Ballard and his team discovered the Titanic's final resting place in 1985, they were overwhelmed. Over 2 miles below the surface, untouched by time, lay the remains of the ship once called Unsinkable. But the ship wasn't empty. Among the mangled steel, shoes lay scattered, heartbreaking reminders of the bodies that once wore them. Decay had taken the flesh, but not the position. Where people had fallen, their shoes often remained, preserved by the cold, high-pressure deep. But then came something else. A body, preserved far better than most, still clothed in fragments of fabric, with arms wrapped around a metal crucifix. The man's remains lay undisturbed. He wasn't trying to flee. He wasn't curled in pain. He was lying still, as if he knew, as if he had accepted it. Was he praying, or had he simply clutched the one thing he believed in as his world collapsed? Who was this man? Let's start with the facts. The crucifix was simple, Catholic in design, not expensive. His clothes weren't luxurious, suggesting he wasn't first class. And he was found in a part of the ship associated with second or third class passengers. So let's narrow it down. Of the 1,500 plus souls lost in the disaster, many were immigrants, Irish, Italian, Eastern European, heading to America for a better life. Most of them were deeply religious and Catholicism was common. But here's where it gets strange. This man's crucifix was made of solid metal, not wood, not plastic. That wasn't cheap, so not dirt poor. He also wore a ring, faded by time, but likely a wedding band. And so the theory emerged. He was a Catholic family man, maybe a husband or father who brought his faith with him across the ocean. When chaos struck, he didn't run. He stayed. He prayed. But again, no one knows his name. Could he be Father Thomas Byles? One popular theory is that this man was Father Thomas Byles, a Catholic priest from England who famously refused a spot on a lifeboat, twice. Instead, he stayed on board, offering last rites and hearing confessions as the ship sank. Eyewitnesses said he stood on deck, surrounded by terrified passengers, reciting the rosary. But there's one major issue. Father Byles went down with the ship on the upper decks. This mystery man was found deep inside the wreck, in a collapsed section of the ship's midsection, so it wasn't him. Some believe this man may have been a steward or crew member, perhaps even someone tasked with comforting passengers. Others think he could have been a third-class passenger from Italy or Ireland who brought a crucifix as a family heirloom or symbol of protection. One chilling theory, he might have gone down to the ship's lower levels on purpose, to hide, to escape, or to die in private. Remember, not everyone panicked. Some people faced death calmly, even spiritually. And maybe that's who this man was. The crucifix was surprisingly well preserved, which shocked experts. Salt water eats away at most metals, but this one remained mostly intact. That means it was made of brass or bronze, not cheap alloys. More interestingly, the crucifix style was very old-fashioned, common in 19th century Italy, Ireland, and Poland. Could this man have been carrying a family relic, a last gift from home? One haunting possibility. Maybe it was a gift from his child, a daughter who kissed it before he boarded, a wife who whispered, "This will keep you safe." And in the end, it was the only thing he had. Why wasn't he identified? You might be thinking, surely someone would have recognized this man. A family member, a survivor? But here's the sad truth. Most of Titanic's victims were never recovered. Only about 340 bodies were officially retrieved by recovery ships. Over 1,100 were left in the sea, many never seen again. Even those who were buried were sometimes mislabeled or wrongly identified. Back then, DNA testing didn't exist. They relied on clothing, notes in pockets, and dental records. And for immigrants, many didn't even have proper documentation. Whole families vanished into the Atlantic without a trace. So the man with the crucifix, he became one of Titanic's unnamed dead. Why does this matter today? Over 100 years later, his story still resonates. Not because he was rich, not because he was famous, but because he was human. We may never know his name, but we know his heart. He died holding on to something millions of people around the world still believe in: faith. In a moment of pure terror when everything fell apart, this man turned not to fear, but to prayer. He didn't die screaming, he died believing. And that makes him more than a mystery. It makes him a symbol. Today, the Titanic's wreck is protected by international agreements. Tourists aren't allowed to remove artifacts. The man with the crucifix remains down there, a silent guardian of the ship's memory. A cold reminder that for every big name, every millionaire and movie-worthy romance, there were hundreds of ordinary people with extraordinary strength. People like him. People who met death not with rage, but with resolve. So who was the man with the crucifix? A father, a husband, a priest? We may never know, but we do know this. He mattered, and he's not forgotten. Enjoying these haunting Titanic stories? Give this channel a like and hit the subscribe button below. Why didn't Titanic have enough lifeboats? And who was to blame? Imagine stepping onto a ship touted as the greatest ever built, only to discover that if it sinks, there's no room for you on a lifeboat. That's not a bad dream. That was reality on the RMS Titanic. Out of more than 2,200 people on board, there were lifeboats for only 1,178. The rest, left to fate. We now know the tragic outcome. Over 1,500 souls lost. But here's the question that still sends shivers down our spine. Why didn't Titanic have enough lifeboats? Who made that choice? And could thousands of lives have been saved with just a few more boats? Let's take a hard look at the mistakes, egos, and outdated rules that doomed so many. God himself could not sink this ship. That infamous quote echoed the arrogance of the age. Titanic was a marvel of technology, design, and luxury. At 882 feet long, it was the largest moving object ever made. It had squash courts, electric elevators, Turkish baths, even a newspaper printed on board. So of course it had to be unsinkable. That illusion of invincibility played a big role in what came next. After all, if the ship can't sink, why worry about escape plans? But there was another, more chilling reason the ship had so few lifeboats. They followed the rules, and those rules were dangerously outdated. The lifeboat law that killed hundreds. In 1912, British maritime law required ships over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats. Sounds okay, right? Here's the problem. Titanic was 46,000 tons, nearly 5 times larger than the biggest ships the law had been written for. And yet, the law hadn't been updated. So Titanic carried the legal minimum, 16 lifeboats, plus 4 collapsible ones for good measure. That brought the total to 20, enough for barely half the passengers and crew. Think about that. Thousands of people boarded the world's most advanced ship, believing they were safe, because it met the law. But the law was broken, not legally, but morally. Here's the part that really stings. Titanic had space for up to 64 lifeboats. That's right, triple the number it actually carried. So why didn't they add more? Simple answer, aesthetics. More lifeboats meant more clutter. More clutter meant less room for promenades, and fewer uninterrupted views of the ocean from the upper decks. And for first-class passengers paying top dollar, elegance mattered. The ship's designers and owners didn't want to ruin the clean lines of the Titanic's decks with bulky wooden boats. One executive famously dismissed the idea of adding more lifeboats by saying it would spoil the look of the ship. Spoil the look? That decision spoiled over 1,500 lives. The man who could have changed everything. Let's talk about Alexander Carlisle, the Titanic's original chief designer. He wanted more lifeboats. In fact, he proposed 64 during the early design stage, enough for everyone on board. But his suggestion was rejected by the White Star Line. It would have cost more, looked worse, and taken up valuable deck space. Carlisle eventually resigned. He knew something was off. After the disaster, he testified heartbroken, saying, "Had my advice been taken, every soul could have been saved." He wasn't exaggerating. The company behind Titanic, White Star Line, was focused on reputation. They didn't compete on speed like their rivals. They competed on luxury. So the priority was comfort, not caution. Ironically, having more lifeboats might have looked like a lack of faith in the ship. Think about it. Putting 64 lifeboats on the unsinkable Titanic would be like installing 10 fire extinguishers in a room made of stone. People would ask, why? What do you know that we don't? So instead, they gambled on appearances, and they lost. You'd think with limited lifeboats, they'd at least fill every seat. But no. When the Titanic struck the iceberg on April 14, 1912, confusion reigned. Officers weren't sure how serious the damage was. Passengers didn't believe they were in danger. And when the lifeboats were finally lowered, many went half-empty. One boat with a 65-person capacity was launched with just 12 people inside. Why? Because people didn't want to leave the unsinkable ship. Others refused to believe women and children should go alone. Some officers feared the lifeboats couldn't handle full loads. That meant dozens of precious seats were wasted in a disaster where seats were everything. Who was to blame? So let's get to the question that matters. Who was responsible? White Star Line executives who prioritized beauty over safety. British Board of Trade, which failed to update lifeboat laws for 20 years. Designers who caved to pressure and removed the extra boats. Government officials who let the shipping industry regulate itself. But perhaps the biggest blame lies in the mindset of the era. Titanic was born in the golden age of industrial confidence. People believed technology could conquer anything: nature, distance, even the ocean. Lifeboats were for lesser vessels, not Titanic. That arrogance cost the lives of men, women, and children, many of whom never even got a chance to try. The public was outraged after the sinking. Families demanded answers. Politicians held hearings. Survivors gave heartbreaking testimonies. One outcome? Lifeboat laws were finally changed. From then on, ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Mandatory lifeboat drills were introduced. Better training, better procedures. But those changes came too late for the 1,500 souls Titanic failed to save. It took a disaster to fix a system that was already broken. Legacy of the lifeboats today. When we see photos of Titanic's grand decks, it's hard not to notice the lifeboats. Just 10 on each side, like ornaments rather than life-saving vessels. They sit there in old black and white images, a quiet reminder of what could have been. The tragedy wasn't just in the sinking, it was in the choices made before the iceberg ever appeared. The Titanic didn't sink because of an iceberg. It sank because of overconfidence, poor regulation, and a devastating underestimation of nature. If they had just doubled the number of lifeboats, if they had listened to the warnings, we might be telling a very different story today. Instead, we remember Titanic not just as a shipwreck, but as a symbol of human error, of how ignoring small details can lead to catastrophic consequences. And perhaps that's the lesson we need now more than ever. The Titanic teaches us that every great fall starts with a whisper, a missed message, an ignored sign, an unopened letter. And history? History is full of whispers we failed to hear, until it was too late. So if this story made you pause, made you wonder what other legends are buried beneath the waves of time, subscribe to Historic Journal, where forgotten stories resurface, and history's hidden truths finally get their voice. Because the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be heard.